Today, we're diving into a story you were never taught in school. Forget what you think you know about peasants, mud, misery, and mindless labor. Because hidden in the fog of the Middle Ages was a village that broke the rules. Where women sued their lords, love defied the class divide, and rebellion didn't begin with swords but with ink. This is the true story of Elmcroft, and what life was really like for a peasant in the Middle Ages. So let's get started. The bells of St. Dunstan's rang at dawn, as they always did in the village of Elmcroft. Chickens clucked, goats bleated, and the heavy fog clung to the earth like a second skin. From the outside, this place looked like the textbook image of peasant misery: wattle and daub huts, muddy paths, and hunched backs. But if you looked closer, you'd see something different. Old Gilda, nearly 60 and still spry, leaned against her broom as she watched her granddaughter haul in 2 buckets of spring water. Inside their home, a fire crackled under an iron cauldron. Dry herbs hung from the rafters. A sheepskin ledger sat tucked beneath the bedding, a record of a small but owned plot of land passed down since the Black Death thinned out the lords and gave the survivors leverage. They weren't serfs anymore. Gilda had bought freedom with bread, literally. During the famine, she fed the reeve's sick wife when the manor cook refused. Later, when the lord needed coin for a new war, Gilda paid in chickens, beer, and silver buttons to buy her family's charter. She wasn't alone. In Elmcroft, 5 out of 10 families weren't bound by labor duties. They were freemen, a status few outside the village would ever believe. And while yes, they toiled, they also brewed. In fact, Gilda's barley ale had become a favorite across the valley. She paid a modest tax to sell it on market days, and in return, she earned enough to buy cloth from Flanders, salt from the coast, and a second mule. There was dignity here. Quiet dignity. But dignity doesn't protect you from myth. The traveling friar who visited Elmcroft last month wrote in his diary, "They live in filth, God help them. They know nothing of law or liberty." He had dined on Gilda's stew. He had slept on her wool mattress. He never asked about the parchment tucked behind her hearth signed by the steward himself. Perhaps he couldn't believe the truth that some peasants understood the law, that they could and did sue their lords, negotiate contracts, and inherit wealth. But there it was. At the edge of the village, young Wymund, barefoot and muddy, stood before the manorial court. His ox had been wrongly seized for a debt he didn't owe. Gilda sat in the back row. She'd coached him the night before. Wymund pulled the folded charter from his tunic and read aloud, voice trembling but clear. He won. The bailiff scowled. The steward grumbled. But the ox was returned. Because the myth is a lie. Not every peasant was crushed beneath a boot. Some stood. Quietly. Firmly. Lawfully. And that was what frightened the lords the most. By midsummer, the fields around Elmcroft blushed gold with barley. The peasants, faces sunburned and hands calloused, worked from sunrise to moonrise. But even toil had its rhythm, and in that rhythm, space for joy. Every year, on the eve of St. Kenelm's Day, the villagers held their summer nighting. A secret gathering the manor officially knew nothing about. On paper, it was a vigil. In truth, it was a feast, a dance, and a defiant breath of freedom. By twilight, the clearing near Widow Thera's barn shimmered with torchlight. Platters of roasted turnips, river trout, and dark brown bread lined the makeshift tables. Jugs of Gilda's amber ale passed from hand to hand. Children laughed. Songs erupted, old songs, from before the Norman tongue arrived. And the dancing god, the dancing. Lettuce, the blacksmith's daughter, whirled in circles, her skirts a blur. She danced with Wymund, with Thera's youngest, even with the manor's stable boy, who had snuck away with his hair down and his eyes gleaming. In that moment, rank meant nothing. Just bodies, music, and earth. But joy is dangerous in a world built on fear. From behind the trees, a shadow watched. Not a manorial guard, no, someone worse, Father Gregor, the newly transferred village priest. Rigid, pale, ice-sharp with suspicion. To him, these songs were pagan remnants. These dances, lustful distractions. And the ale? Unlicensed, untaxed, unholy. The next morning, the bell tolled not for mass, but for judgment. The manor court, stirred by Father Gregor's letter, charged 5 villagers with unlawful assembly and heretical celebration. Gilda was fined heavily. Wymund was made to spend a day in the stocks. But it was Lettuce who paid the highest price. She was accused of leading the dance, inciting unchaste behavior, the charge read. The bailiff offered a choice: marry a man of the manor's choosing or be whipped before the chapel. Lettuce chose neither. That night she vanished. Some said she fled to the woods, joined a band of outlaws. Others claimed she was hiding in the monastery at Almsbrook under a false name. A few whispered that she'd made it to London, working in a tavern, biding her time. Whatever the truth, the summer nighting ended that year. But the songs didn't. By candlelight, mothers hummed the melodies while weaving baskets. Children tapped out the dance steps in silence. And though the ale no longer flowed in public, the rebellion in their hearts grew stronger. The lords could fine them. The church could scold them. But they couldn't unteach joy. And joy, once forbidden, becomes more than pleasure. It becomes power. That peasants had no need for parchment. They have their hands for work, not for writing, he'd chuckle, ink-stained fingers laced behind his back. But in the village of Elmcroft, one woman turned ink into revolution. Her name was Alice Weaver, daughter of a cloth dyer, widow of a thatcher, mother of 4. At first glance, she was unremarkable, sharp-eyed, sure, but quiet, observant, and always at the loom. What few knew was that Alice could read and write Latin, a skill she learned in girlhood while sweeping the floors of the priory where her aunt once served. She'd copied prayers by candlelight. Later, she began copying contracts. And she remembered. Years passed. Her husband died in a roofing accident. The Lord's Reeve tried to seize their cottage, claiming he still owed a year's service. But Alice, calm and composed, unrolled a hidden scroll, a manumission writ signed by the Lord's predecessor, long deceased. It had been tucked in a hollow beam above the hearth. The Reeve turned pale. By law, it stood. But Alice didn't stop there. She began helping others quietly, discreetly. When Thera's son wanted to leave for the abbey but feared the labor dues would follow him, Alice showed him how to write a letter of exemption. When Gilda wanted to pass her brewing rights to her niece, Alice drafted a copy of a merchant's clause she'd once seen in a London market stall. Word spread, only in whispers, never aloud. They called her the Ink Widow. One day, she discovered a loophole. Buried in a forgotten copy of the manorial register she had secretly copied years earlier. It stated that any laborer who could prove 3 generations of continuous service to the same land could claim it outright during a time of lordly absence. That moment came during the Great Campaign, when the Baron was called to fight in France and left his lands under temporary wardship. Alice struck. She gathered 5 families, each with lineages clear and provable. With calligraphy that mimicked the steward's own, she drafted charters of hereditary tenancy, citing the very law the manor forgot it had. When the steward returned months later, he tried to challenge them. But the ink had dried, the documents were sealed, and the court at Almsbrook upheld them. The manor had no choice. The peasants had one land, legally. But now suspicion brewed. One morning, Alice found her door ajar, her loom smashed, and her ink bottles shattered. Still, she kept writing, just in smaller letters hidden in cookbooks and sewing guides. She taught 2 of her children to write, and sent one to apprentice with a town notary. Because she knew, a sword may win a battle, but a contract can win a century. And across the villages of the valley, others began to write. First in charcoal, then ink, then iron gall. Peasants. Writing. Claiming. Winning. The steward grew restless. The Lord grew angry. But the people, they grew powerful. They met beneath the hawthorn tree at dusk. Lady Isabel, daughter of Baron Leoric, was no stranger to rebellion, but hers was not waged with blades or banners. Her weapons were words, books, and the sharp gaze that cut deeper than silk ever could. She had been raised in the manor house above Elmcroft, schooled by private tutors, promised to a distant nobleman she had never met. She detested it all. One autumn afternoon, while slipping out of the manor gardens to escape a lesson on courtly etiquette, she encountered Tomas the thatcher's son, shirt damp with sweat, sleeves rolled to his elbows as he repaired a stable roof. Their eyes met. A single pause. That was all. Tomas, broad-shouldered and quiet, was known in Elmcroft for his skill with thatch, and for his silence. But Isabel saw something else in him. Curiosity, restraint, and a quiet fire that rivaled her own. What began with stolen glances soon became meetings in secret. In the glen, at the edge of the barley fields, beneath the chapel's crumbling rear wall, they spoke of poetry. She quoted Ovid. He recited peasant songs with verses Isabel had never heard, verses rich with longing and grief. They kissed, and with each passing day the stakes grew higher, because Tomas wasn't just any peasant. He was Alice Weaver's eldest son, a boy raised on loopholes, land rights, and a mother's whispered warning. If they see you rise, they will try to bury you. Isabel began slipping him scrolls, texts her tutor left behind. One was a royal decree on land inheritance, another a Latin translation of the Magna Carta. She wasn't just in love. She was lighting a fuse. But they weren't as hidden as they believed. Father Gregor, ever watchful, had noticed Isabel's absences. So had the steward's daughter, Maud, who once fancied Tomas herself. Rumors stirred like a storm on the horizon. When Isabel gave Tomas a leather ring crafted from her own riding strap, it sealed their doom. The scandal broke at a winter feast. A drunken noble spotted the ring on Tomas's finger and demanded to know how a commoner came to wear it. Tomas said nothing. But Isabel, bold as ever, stood up before the assembled hall and answered, "Because I gave it to him." Silence. Then uproar. The steward nearly fainted. Baron Leoric's goblet shattered in his hand. Father Gregor crossed himself and bellowed something about damnation. Tomas was seized, shackled, accused of seducing a noblewoman under false pretenses. Alice tried to intervene but was held back. The village murmured of a show trial, a whipping, or worse. But before punishment could be carried out, Tomas escaped. Some say Isabel bribed a guard. Others claim he slipped free on his own. Either way, by morning he was gone and Isabel was locked in her chamber under threat of confinement in a nunnery. But the spark had caught. Their love, reckless and raw, became legend in Elmcroft. It crossed lines not meant to be crossed, of class, power, and expectation. And in their wake, others began asking dangerous questions. Why shouldn't a peasant read noble texts? Why shouldn't a lord's daughter choose love over status? And who gave these men, lords, priests, and stewards the right to decide what was proper? The answer would not come in sermons or punishments. It would come soon in fire. The year began with promise. The rains came early, the meadows flowered thick and fast, and the barley rose high, so high it brushed the hips of the children who played near the hedgerows. But by midsummer, the skies changed. The wind shifted. The clouds grew heavy. Then came the rains. And they did not stop. By Lammas, the wheat had drowned. The barley had rotted black at the root. Potatoes hadn't even been planted. This was a land before such blessings. The peasants of Elmcroft had little more than sodden grain, spoiled beans, and an ache in their bellies. A bad harvest wasn't rare. But this one was different. This one lingered, festered, and turned neighbor against neighbor. At first, they rationed. Bread grew thinner. Ale soured. Then animals began disappearing, first a goat, then a lamb, then Thera's prized pig, which had vanished one stormy night. She accused her neighbor's boy, who denied it with tears in his eyes. The boy was found days later, beaten and left in the woods. No one confessed. And when old Bert collapsed in the village square, his lips cracked and dry, Father Gregor did not bring water. He brought judgment. He stood atop the chapel steps, cloak whipping in the wind, and declared that the harvest had failed not because of rain, but because of sin. Witchcraft has returned to this land, he bellowed. And God's punishment has only just begun. The villagers, starved and afraid, turned their heads toward widow Thera. She was strange, yes? Lived alone since her husband vanished 2 winters past. Grew herbs behind her cottage. Knew the names of plants the priest couldn't pronounce. When Wyman's baby had a fever, she gave him a powder and the child lived. That, Gregor claimed, was proof. She cheats death, he cried, because she serves another master. Some resisted. Alice tried to speak on Thera's behalf, but her voice was drowned in fear. Even Gilda, usually bold, remained silent. Hunger does strange things to people. Thera was dragged to the edge of the village and tied to the oak stump. They did not burn her, no firewood to spare. They shamed her, stripped her, spat on her. Father Gregor placed a penitence veil over her head and declared her to be watched for signs of the devil's favor. But the next morning, the rain stopped. By coincidence or miracle, the sky cleared. And that was enough. To some, it meant the curse had lifted. To others, it meant Thera truly held dark power. She was left alone, but watched. Always watched. And deep in the night, a child knocked on her door. Then another. And another. Not to accuse her. To ask for help. Because when the world falls apart, the people don't turn to the church. They turn to the ones who kept them alive. And Thera, despite her scars, still knew how to make salves. Still knew how to find roots. Still knew how to heal. As the winter crept in, bitter and lean, the priest's sermons grew louder. But his chapel grew emptier. The bitter cold of winter had passed, but the chill in the hearts of Elmcroft's peasants had only deepened. Taxes were heavier than ever. Tithes claimed more than the harvest could give. The Lord's men marched through the village, demanding coin, grain, and obedience with a cruelty that had no mercy for the starving. Yet beneath the frost-hardened fields something was stirring, a whispered defiance that no one in power expected. It began in the dim corners of the taverns and in the shadows of burnt-out hearths. Wymund, now a grown man and emboldened by his legal victory, gathered the restless. Alongside him stood the blacksmith's son, Tomas, still missing but never forgotten, and a secret ally, Sir Aldric, a nobleman disillusioned by the endless wars abroad and the corruption festering at home. Sir Aldric had once been a knight of great promise. But after losing his family to disease and witnessing the greed of his peers, he returned to Elmcroft with a fire in his eyes, not for the crown or the church, but for justice. Together, the unlikely trio forged a plan. They met under cover of night, voices low and tense. The peasants, armed with little more than pitchforks, farming tools, and courage, dreamed of more than survival, they dreamed of freedom. But the plan had a shadow. Among them walked a spy, Maud, the steward's daughter, with secrets darker than the coldest winter night. She listened, recorded, and fed every word to her father and the Lord's men. The night before the uprising, a feast was held, secret, joyous, defiant. Gilda poured ale as the village hummed with nervous excitement. Torches flickered, eyes gleamed with hope and fear. Then came the signal. At dawn, the villagers marched. They moved swiftly, targeting the tax office, the manor's granary, the symbols of their oppression. Smoke rose, alarm bells rang, and the manor was thrown into chaos. But the king's men were faster than expected. Soldiers arrived on horseback, clad in steel, their banners snapping in the wind. The peasants fought bravely, but they were no match for the trained forces. Many were captured, Wymund among them. Tomas was missing, presumed fled. The Lord's justice was swift and cruel. Public executions were announced. But the peasants refused to be broken. Behind the walls of their prison, whispers grew louder. Because rebellion was not just about weapons. It was about hope. And hope, once sparked, could never be extinguished. The morning sun cast long shadows over the village square, where the gathered crowd awaited with a mixture of dread and defiance. The king's men had returned, their armor gleaming, their faces hard and unyielding. At their center stood Wymund, bound in rough ropes, his eyes steady despite the chill biting through his threadbare tunic. The charges were clear: treason, arson, and sedition. The punishment meant to serve as a grim warning to any who dared to defy the crown. As the makeshift tribunal assembled under the gnarled oak, the very tree where dances once sparked rebellion, Gilda stood at the back, clutching a faded parchment, heart-pounding. Her son had been caught, and the hope of the village rested on a knife's edge. "I was the spy," she confessed, her voice trembling but clear. "But I do not stand with those who oppress my people. I have seen their courage. I have seen their pain. Wymund is no traitor, he is a man who dared to seek justice." Gasps echoed through the square. Corbin's face turned red with fury. "Lies," he spat. But Maud held up a piece of parchment, one that none expected, a secret letter from Sir Aldric pledging support for the peasants' cause and condemning the steward's cruelty. Before the bailiff could react, chaos erupted. A group of villagers surged forward, shouting and waving makeshift weapons. The king's men struggled to maintain order, but the crowd's fury was unstoppable. In the confusion, Wymund was freed, his bonds cut by unseen hands. Yet the cost was high. Several rebels were captured in the fray. Among them was Lettuce, the blacksmith's daughter, long believed lost after her disappearance years before. Her return was no accident. She stepped forward from the crowd, bruised but unbroken, and addressed the villagers with fire in her eyes. "We will not be slaves to fear. We will not be silenced by chains." Her words ignited the hearts of all who heard. The village burned that day, not with the flames of destruction, but with a blaze of rebellion and resolve. But the lords were not finished. They would respond with fire. The village still smoldered from the fires of rebellion, but the deepest wounds were not on the fields or in the charred timbers, they were in the hearts of the people. Trust had been shattered. Maud, the steward's daughter turned unlikely heroine, had stirred hope and chaos in equal measure. She had saved Wymund and exposed the steward's cruelty, yet no one knew her true allegiance, not even herself. Behind closed doors, Maud wrestled with a secret darker than the ash-strewn streets. For years, she had walked two paths, daughter of privilege by day, informer by night. But after witnessing the peasants' courage and suffering, she found her loyalties torn. Then came the final blow. One cold evening, as the village gathered in a hidden cellar to plot their next move, Maud's whispered confession shattered the fragile peace. "I am the spy," she said. "But not by choice. I was forced. My father threatened my mother's life." Shock rippled through the room. Some shouted betrayal, others forgiveness. But before anyone could act, the cellar's hidden door creaked open. A band of armed men spilled in, the Lord's enforcers, tipped off by another traitor in their midst. Maud's eyes darted, her breath caught in her throat. She looked to the crowd and made a choice. "I stand with you. Let me lead you." Her words were desperate but sincere. With trembling hands, she revealed the identity of the new spy, Old Bert, the village elder, whose fear of change had led him to betray his own people. The revelation stunned the rebels. Bert, once a revered voice of wisdom, was dragged away in chains. But Maud's gamble was not without cost. The Lord's men swarmed the cellar, capturing several key figures, including Alice Weaver's youngest son. Maud fled into the night, no longer a spy but hunted by both sides. Yet as she disappeared into the dark woods, she knew the rebellion's fate rested on a razor's edge. Would they crumble under betrayal, or rise, united by fire and truth? The answer lay ahead. The village of Elmcroft had endured fire, betrayal, and loss. Many believed hope was a dying ember, but in the shadows a new force was rising. Her name was Ellis, daughter of Alice Weaver and sister to Thomas. Unlike her fierce brother, Ellis was quiet and thoughtful, educated in the ways of the church and versed in the laws whispered among the villagers. Her sharp mind and steady hand had long made her a trusted advisor to the community. When Maud vanished into the forest and the rebellion's leaders were imprisoned or scattered, Ellis stepped forward. She did not brandish weapons or raise banners. Instead, she wielded diplomacy, knowledge, and an unshakable will. Ellis forged unlikely alliances. She reached out to the abbey monks, appealing to their sense of justice. She sent letters to sympathetic nobles and clergy in nearby towns, weaving a delicate web of influence. And most importantly, she negotiated directly with Baron Leoric, whose patience was wearing thin. The village watched with a mixture of hope and skepticism as Ellis met the Baron in the Great Hall, a place once filled with scorn and power. There, she spoke not as a rebellious peasant but as a representative of her people, armed with parchment and petition. Her words were precise, her voice unwavering. She demanded fair rents, protection from unlawful taxes, and rights to inherit and cultivate land without interference. Baron Leoric, impressed and wary, saw in her not a threat but a chance for peace. The negotiations were grueling, stretching over weeks, marked by moments of tension and quiet breakthroughs. But Ellis proved herself a master of patience and strategy. In the end, the Baron agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to a charter of rights that would change Elmcroft forever. The villagers celebrated quietly. No banners flew, no trumpets sounded. But in every home, the news spread like wildfire. Ellis had become their peasant queen, not by birthright, but by courage, wisdom, and unyielding determination. Yet shadows lingered. Her rise had made enemies, among nobles who saw her as a dangerous precedent, among clergy suspicious of her influence, and among peasants who doubted the cost of peace. And so, as Ellis prepared to lead her people into a new era, she knew the battle was far from over. Because true power was not given, it was fought for every day. Years had passed since the fires of rebellion and the uneasy peace forged by Ellis, the peasant queen. The village of Elmcroft slowly healed, its fields greener and its people freer than any had dared imagine. Yet beneath the calm, a secret slept, one that would challenge the very foundations of power. In a dusty attic long forgotten by the manor's keepers, a chest was uncovered by a curious servant. Inside lay brittle parchments, yellowed with age but meticulously preserved. Among them was a charter unlike any other, a manifesto penned in the neat, deliberate hand of a woman whose name had been erased from history. The document demanded rights, wages, and justice for the peasants. It detailed laws for fair labor, protections against arbitrary punishment, and a vision of a world where birth did not dictate destiny. This was no ordinary text. It was the work of Alice Weaver's youngest daughter, the very woman who had been sentenced to death during the trial by fire. But that execution had never happened. Lettuce, the blacksmith's daughter who vanished years ago, had faked her death, escaping the village under cover of darkness. She had lived in exile, learning the laws of distant cities, studying under scholars, and gathering knowledge forbidden to those of her birth. From the shadows, Lettuce had rewritten history. She sent secret letters back to Elmcroft, inspired Ellis and others, and kept alive the flame of rebellion, not with swords, but with words. When the charter was finally revealed, it ignited a firestorm. Nobles denounced it as heresy. Clergy called it blasphemy. But peasants saw it as a beacon. Across the land, villages echoed with its demands. The struggle for justice had found a voice louder than any sword. And somewhere, in a quiet cottage miles away, Lettuce smiled. Her fight was not just for Elmcroft, it was for every forgotten soul crushed beneath feudal chains. Her legacy was clear: change could come from the most unlikely places. That a single life, a single pen, could alter the course of history. And that sometimes the greatest revolutions are written not in blood, but in ink. I hope you enjoyed the journey through Elmcroft. If you want more stories like this, twists, truths, and forgotten voices, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Thanks for watching.